With tensions escalating between the United States of America and China, a little bit of history could perhaps just save us from the madness of World War III, and in particular, a better understanding of the history, the global history of World War II could save us from that catastrophe. Because the global war of World War II did not begin in Munich in 1938. It did not begin with German armies marching into Poland in 1939. It began in China in 1937. If we understand that, we might just come to a better understanding of the role of China and the United States in today's multipolar world. Let's have a look at a great history book that will help you understand that too. One great history book that can really help you understand and reimagine the role of China in today's world is Rana Mitter's Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, 1937 to 1945. I think it also might, in some countries, go under the title of China's Good War. And this book is one of several books that I'm trying to draw attention to on this channel by really good historians, readable historians, who can shed new light on the deep and complex history of today's multipolar world so that you can understand how the world is changing around us and make your own good decisions about it. And in this video, I'm going to give you a quick, short introduction to that book. And at the end of the video, if you hang around to then, I'm going to give you one crucial insight that the historian Rana Mitter, the author of Forgotten Ally, has offered into the nature of China's rise, the nature of China's perceived role in the world, and how it could reshape the world order, the multipolar world, not necessarily in a disastrous way, but in a way that does not require war, certainly, and does not require some of the alarmist rhetoric that we're hearing out of the United States of America in particular. So looking at history, looking at the history of World War II is increasingly becoming important in understanding geopolitical events today. It is actually quite a remarkable thing about how much there are references and echoes of World War II events and the nature of the international institutions of the United Nations, the United Nations Security Council, the world order that was formed in 1945 in the current conflicts. The Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, refers commonly to how many countries in the West have come to assume that the nature of international institutions, the nature of the political settlement that was formed in 1945, is just the way it is, and it's the natural order of things, whereas in fact a more multipolar world is the natural state of things, and some of the conflicts today are about coming to terms with a new balance of power in the world. And what's more, it's essential to understand World War II, not just with the stories we've all grown up with, like in Hollywood, Saving Private Ryan, and 1,000 other movies where America liberates Europe from German occupation and saves the free world. It is also important to understand World War II as a conflict involving Russia. 27 million people from the Soviet Union died in World War II, and only about, I think, 400,000 from the United States of America, but also from China. This book by Rana Mitter, Forgotten Ally, really shines a spotlight on that forgotten role of China in World War II, including the fact that World War II, the global conflict around World War II, really began with what is sometimes called the Second Sino-Chinese-Japanese War, which began in 1937. And if you read this book, or if you also listen to some of the podcasts and broadcasts that Rana Mitter has done about this book and about China, some of the shorter pieces that he's written about China, you will come to a much deeper, more complex understanding, not only of World War II, not only of geopolitics, but quite specifically, you'll come to a better understanding of the conflict between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. You'll come to a better understanding of the flashpoint issue of Taiwan, which really has its origins in the conflicts within China between the Communist Party of China, the Nationalist Party of China, and the pro-Japanese group within China in this era of 1937 to 1945, where China fought Japan with America and the other allies as an ally, as an absolutely crucial part of World War II. It's a wonderfully written book. Rana Mitter is an extraordinary, fluent, personable speaker. So really, check out some of the links I'll include below about some of his talks about this issue. And I confess, before I read this book, a lot of these things were only very vaguely understood by me. I'd heard of Chiang Kai-shek, but I couldn't really explain to you what Chiang Kai-shek's role was. And I had absolutely no idea of both the argument that World War II really began in 1937, or even further back, arguably back to 1931, when Japan sort of invades Manchuria, and perhaps everyone's maybe even familiar with accounts of the lead up to World War II, of Japan sort of storming out or being expelled from the League of Nations because of its sort of occupation of Manchuria in northern China.
British Movietone News enables you to witness one of the most momentous episodes in post-war history.
Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
The Japanese delegates refuse to accept the decision and sensationally walk out of the Assembly.
So I've learned a lot from this book, and I'd highly recommend it to you to learn a lot from this book too. So some of the key things is the explanation of the complex, difficult period of the sort of lead up to the war in 1937, the role of Japan in being, I guess, both aggressive and in a way defensive Asian imperial power during the 1920s and 1930s, the warlord period in China in the 1920s, but also the multiple paths that China could have gone. Ultimately, China chose the path of the Communist Party and Mao, but Rana Mitter does a wonderful job of explaining how there were other possibilities there in Chinese history. And he has a wonderful way of not letting his own views dominate the narrative, but letting the real voices of history come through and the real contingencies and different possibilities of history come through. You'll learn about the rape of Nanking, which for a while in the 1930s and 1940s was the capital of China, because the northern capital was sort of occupied by the Chinese. And which was a terrible, terrible massacre and firebombing and all sorts of atrocities. But you'll also learn of some of the cruel, despotic actions by the nationalists in China. There was a case where Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the nationalist group, who subsequently fled to Taiwan and formed a kind of a military dictatorship in Taiwan that claimed to be the true government of China, and which, if you like, the independent Taiwanese movement is the successor of. Chiang Kai-shek at one point deliberately blew up a dam and flooded an area of China that killed like 1 million people. And it was a terrible atrocity with the intention of slowing down a Japanese advance, but one that was, a cruel action against his own people, one that strained relationships within China and strained relationships with American allies as well. You'll learn about the very tense relationships between the American generals and diplomats and the Chinese government. And you will get the sense of the very strong military involvement of America in China, the crucial importance to the Americans of keeping China in the war, even though it was at the cost of an extraordinary number of lives. And you will also learn that in this war, the Sino-Japanese War, the Second World War, if you like, China's role in the Second World War, 14 million Chinese people died. Now, I did not know that before I'd read this, and it's one of those extraordinary facts, I guess, that sort of shakes up your understanding of history and of the importance of key events in history from different perspectives. I've long known that Russia lost, or the Soviet Union, now multiple states, lost over 27 million people in World War II. And you go to Russia today and you still sense the profundity of that loss in the war memorials and other commemorations. But 14 million people died in China's Second World War, and that compares to only 400,000 from the United States of America and 400,000 from the British Empire. World War II was as much fought in China as anything, and the consequences of World War II are deeply profound still for today's history, today's geopolitics, and today the stories that people in China, people in America, people in Australia still tell people in India, because there's a connection there between India and China that goes to World War II as well. But the stories we tell perhaps need to be reframed by a deeper appreciation and empathy for the nature of the multiple experiences of World War II within China. And what you'll also learn is that at the end of the war, so the war ends in 1945, there's a very complex ending to it with tensions between the United States, the different parties within China, and with the Soviet Union and with Japan. The Soviet Union had been determined to keep Japan, to not declare war on Japan, because after all, Germany had marched all the way to Moscow and to Leningrad. The last thing they needed was invasion from the east, from Japan, and Japan had actually intervened in the 18 to 22 Russian Civil War as well, alongside America. So the last thing they needed there was that. So there's this very complicated ending to the war as well. But then there's also, within China, the consequences of the war erode the credibility and authority of the Chiang Kai-shek nationalist regime, and ultimately in 1949 lead to the Chinese Revolution and the success of the formation of the People's Republic of China under the leadership of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China. And this was the last thing the Americans wanted. And it had a profound consequence at the onset of the Cold War also to how the story of World War II was told. There was a huge debate, which Rana Mitter describes in a wonderful epilogue to his book, The Enduring War. He describes how there then becomes this, that the memories of China's role in World War II went down into the memory hole and were kind of forgotten about, because within America there was a huge debate about who lost China. And within China there was deep resentment about the fact that America saw China as ultimately serving their geopolitical interests in Asia, to be a huge source for commercial success, rather than the liberation and the improvement of the lives of the Chinese people. And of course, the nationalist regime fled mainland China and rebased themselves in Taiwan, which led to the entire problem of Taiwan today, which I briefly talked about in the video I did on Odd Ane Westad, the Cold War. And what he also shows is that today in contemporary China under Xi Jinping, there's a strong use of memories of World War II to unify Chinese society, and ongoing, bitterness towards Japan about the nature of its involvement in the war, ongoing bitterness about America's exploitation of the results of the war, and a continuing, fear of social disorder that was based in that long, difficult period of China's experience of World War II. What Rana Mitter also points out is, in a way, there's this remarkable triumph for China in the late 1940s. At the end of, they defeated Japan after all. Japan that had been much more successful prior to then in terms of modernizing and becoming a strong Asian power. China ultimately defeated Japan. And at the end of World War II, China, Ranamita says, becomes an actual sovereign nation for the first time since 1842, when the European powers forced various forms of subjection and port treaties and opium wars and whatnot on China. Now, finally, China was a sovereign nation. And this was also reflected in the fact that China was made a member of the United Nations Security Council. But the internal conflict in China between the nationalists and the communists, overlaid with America's long crusading habit of, wanting to get the governments around the world that it wants, meant that America, after the Chinese Revolution in 1939, it took America another 30 years to establish formal diplomatic relations with China. And there was an ongoing sense from China that America never really accepted, the outcomes of World War II, the outcomes of the Chinese Revolution, the outcomes that it never really accepted China as a legitimate player in the world order. And that you can hear that same condescending rhetoric in some of the shrill anti-China hawks in America today. So highly recommend Ranamita's Forgotten Ally. And if you have trouble getting the book, look out for a couple of the podcasts that he's done. He did a great 2-part episode on the Rest is History podcast, talking about this book and talking about China's Second World War. Highly recommend it. He's also, I'd say, Ranamita makes quite a few commentaries about current events, and he published in the last year or so a really interesting article which I think offers a special insight, a special additional insight from an historian about how to avoid war between the United States and China. And this really goes to how China conceptualizes world order. China is not seeking to overthrow and humiliate America. It is not seeking worldwide domination, despite some of the fantastic paranoid fantasy of some American politicians. Rather, China is trying to present itself as a collaborative power within a genuine multipolar world that is actually genuinely committed to an international order, perhaps not exactly as America defines that international order, but that is a reasonable revisionist interpretation of the rules of the United Nations. Ranamita argues that China is a revisionist, not a revolutionary power when it comes to world order. It's not looking to blow the place up. It's looking for all states, all sovereign states, to be treated equally in accordance with the United Nations Charter and respectfully given their various cultures, histories, economies, roles in the world. And I think if we really do incorporate this into our understanding, we perhaps could just calm some of our more militant political leaders down and avoid the prospect of a catastrophic war between China and the United States. And it's something that's as important in Australia as it is in America, because some of the rhetoric in recent times has been aggressively zealous, let's say. But let me just read from this little section of Rana Mitter's article. It's a piece called, it basically argues that China accepts the basic framework of the United Nations. It doesn't accept the American interpretation, a very exceptionalist interpretation of the United Nations. China's sense of its own place in international society cannot be defined simply in terms of a revolutionary shift away from the post-1945 order, nor simple incremental revisionism. Rather, it has used a variety of tools to create a structure, to create a shift in which the structures of global order are, if anything, mostly preserved, but appropriated or redefined according to a Chinese world view. The piece examines, and you can see this, he argues, in China's attitudes towards sovereignty, its use of its own modern history, its appropriation of political language. For example, China argues it is a form of democracy. And I think this is an important insight. As some Americans beat the drum accusing China of being an international criminal terrorist organization and committing war crimes against the American people by competing with them economically, we really ought to understand that China has an important, crucial place in all of our histories, and that it is fundamentally supportive of a United Nations-based form of world order, committed to general principles we all can accept, even if we may disagree about how they're explicitly articulated. But by talking about that, we may come to more reasonable understandings of what the rules of a free and fair world really are. If we understand China's history of World War II better, then we can understand how China, along with Russia and India and the BRICS nations and most of the global South, wants to renovate the post-1945 world order as institutionalized in the United Nations, as most critically institutionalized in the United Nations Security Council, and to find a different but better path to peaceful development and coexistence amongst all states. If the world could just persuade America to step back a little bit from world domination and find a way to talk that through with the other powers of the world would be a safer place. Now, some of that is my interpretation of events rather than Rana Mitter's interpretation of events, but totally recommend Rana Mitter's Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, 1937 to 1945. And if you found this interesting, this is the kind of video I like to do on this channel: books, history, how it relates to the changing world about us, and how reading some of these different perspectives on the world can shake up some of the images that have locked us into two fixed positions and help us see our fellow citizens of the world in new and more empathetic ways. So if you like this kind of stuff, do subscribe. You can also read some of my writing at jeffrich.substack.com. You can sign up to my newsletter there, and you can also check out this playlist on some of the other insights from historians on avoiding a conflict between the United States and China. I'll see you in the next video.